Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're here today with Peter Kolar for an hour-long intensive workshop where we get to ask all the questions we've ever had about music and style within the bilingual and Spanish-speaking worshiping community. So, Peter, thank you for being here. Thank you for being with us. If you're just arriving here, remember there's a chat feature at the bottom of your screen. Go ahead and click on that. Chat will show up on your right side, and you can say hello to everybody and let us know where you're chiming in from. We've got New Jersey, we've got New York, we've got Chicago. So go ahead and keep chiming in and keep the chat alive through the whole hour. Since this is also a Q&A intensive day with Peter, you'll want to be well acquainted with the Q&A button. It's also on the bottom of your screen if you're on a desktop. You see Q&A there, and a separate window will open. And this helps us to keep track of the questions, and if there's any that we can answer in writing, we'll go ahead and do that. Otherwise, we'll try to answer them all live so we can capture it then on this recorded video. Just a little a notice for you too. Remember that we're doing these every day, and we have been for like 4 weeks now. So we're getting to know each other real well through the course of these videos. Tomorrow's session is with Alice Parker and Gabe Huck on her new book called The Gift of Song. So don't miss that. Make sure to register for that one tomorrow at 1 as well. But here we are. Peter, oh, I forgot. The last thing is that if you haven't already, make sure to watch the partner video with this one where Peter's walking through in more of a workshop presentation fashion some of the items that we can kind of dive further into today. So, Peter, thank you.
Wonderful. Bienvenidos a todos. What a great joy it is to be here. And I'm absolutely thrilled. I'm thrilled that so many of you have shown up for today. And the topic is just that. We're here as musicians, and we're gonna explore some musical intricacies and all those kind of things that bring us joy in our ministry. So I am the Spanish and bilingual resources editor for GIA. And part of my responsibilities is to create the resources for you all to use at the parish level. And a lot of that has to do with the written component of it, but I think the more hands-on, let's say the Caribeno aspect of it, the carne, the meat and the flesh on the bones, really has to do with how the music is realized in actual worship, how it's done in real time. And the interpretation, la interpretación, as we would call it in Spanish, has much to do with conveying the spirit of the music at hand. And so that's why, for me especially, I think diving into the topic of styles is of such great intrigue. It's something that I love, and of all the things that when I go out on the road and present to dioceses and parishes and such, the thing that I enjoy most is really diving into the musical nuts and bolts of the styles. So like Kate said, if you haven't had a chance to go and view the workshop, that gives you the kind of the step-by-step tour of certain styles. And in that workshop, I explored 3 styles in particular, because they're kind of they're like primary colors, and a lot of the other styles are derivatives of them. And those are the polka, the waltz, and the bolero. And I chose those specifically because I think they have the most immediate liturgical application. And if you pick up an accompaniment book or a hymnal and you flip through the pages, those pieces can be brought to life in any number of different ways. And you can simply apply some of these mechanics of the styles to a piece, to the very same piece, and render it in different ways. And all of a sudden it has a different nuance, like looking at it through a different prism. And because of that, it then lends itself to different liturgical application. So that's kind of the gist of it. I could do some review. I could actually spend some more time and explore some of the things that I didn't get to in the workshop, including some more advanced styles that are, really, really interesting to look at. And I also want to hear from all of you. So if you had, whether or not you had watched the session already, or we'll go back and do it later, if you just have some questions that you want to throw my way, I'm all game, and I want to answer that to the best of my ability, you know, from my experience, and try to give you and equip you with the kind of things as you're foraying into this yourself. So,
Sure.
is there anything that we should start out with, or?
Well, I think, yeah, let's do as much of the full spectrum as we can in terms of basics to more advanced in this next hour. So I want to start us off, if we can. Again, throw your questions our way whenever you think of them. But I think a lot of the intimidation about, if you're coming from a kind of one who studied Western music or is coming from an Anglo background, I think one of the intimidating things about it is you look at the music for the Spanish Mass or event, or however you're entering into this multicultural experience, if that's the case, and you say, where are all the notes? Because maybe you just see the words, or maybe you just see the words and then a chord symbol, or what you think is a chord symbol, but it's actually looks more like solfege than maybe what you're used to seeing. So what do you do, and how can we not be so intimidated about that?
Yeah, that's one of the things that I touch on this a little bit in the workshop, and it's worth reiterating here. So I'm a trained musician. I studied music. I studied piano, actually, as did you, Kate. So, you know, we both know what it's like to approach it from that direction. At the same time, I also grew up playing by ear. And I attribute a lot of that to my father, who was a self-taught accordionist, and my brothers and sisters and I comprised a family polka band. And so at age 3 and 4, I was learning melodies and just committing them to memory by ear, and kind of training, you know, all those synapses inside the brain to process music in that way. And so I was blessed with that opportunity. But it's also similar to the way that a lot of Spanish speakers will approach music learning. And the music repertoire is really an oral repertoire that's passed down. You'll hear a lot of cultures talk about this too. I mean, Roger Holland talked about this quite a bit, you know, with spirituals and an African-American community and other cultures as well. So the interesting choque, the collision of sorts, is where you have this great oral tradition of music and repertoire that's handed down, now colliding squarely with a publisher whose sole purpose is to provide things in print for people then to digest and replicate that music. And so for a lot of these traditional pieces, you can name any number of them: Altissimo Señor, Bendito Bendito, the popular charismatic tunes, Alabaré. You have a lot of these that are simply transmitted. They're played on a guitar, a melody is sung, and they're just kind of replicated, not as an exact science, but simply as, you know, the shape, the spirit of the melody. All the rancheros, all the tunes that were sung by the, you know, the golden era greats of the Mexican singers, you know, Pedro Infante, Javier Solis, you know, they were just, you know, this is music that is just kind of felt and embodied. My father-in-law has a beautiful voice. He wouldn't consider himself a musician, but he's one of the most gorgeous voices I've heard. And he's just a library of tunes. And he doesn't read music or anything like that, but it's just all this is committed to memory. So it's a wondrous gift. And for those of us who don't think in that way, it's very intimidating. You know, it can be very intimidating, and many of us are tied to notes. And I've seen this, and we've experienced this too. I've seen some, and I've worked with some wonderful orchestral players, but if you go outside the sphere of what's on the page, completely lost. You know, some wonderful accompanists who can get and nail every single note. But outside of that, or say, okay, can we bump it up a key, or can we take it, you know, down to, or can we put it in this style? If it's not on the page, it's outside of their realm of capability to be able to process. So getting back to my point of oral meeting written, so a lot of the music then has to be transcribed or understood and transcribed at some point in that piece's history. And then that gets put in a book. And so the caveat here is for us who operate in written music realm to realize that that music existed far before it got written down, and it will continue to morph and develop under the church's wisdom and purview in ways beyond what's on the page here. So it's really just a snapshot of one person's interpretation and understanding of that to have written it down. And so I think the main caution here is to not think that that is how the piece goes. Even something as ubiquitous as Pascal De Hombres, we have a refrain that goes, and if you know this song, you know that it starts with a dotted quarter note. Señor, me has mirado a los. If you hear a Spanish speaker sing it, they will unequivocally sing it as an eighth note. Señor. And then there's another phrase later on in that refrain. Sonriendo, has dicho mi nombre. That's how he wrote it. And he's a Spanish speaker, a native Spanish speaker, a Spaniard. But the word sonriendo is 3 syllables. Sonriendo, not sonriendo. It's not 4 syllables. And so the Spanish speakers will always go, sonriendo, has dicho mi nombre. And if we're not knowing better how the language somewhat has governance over how that's supposed to be sung, you might say as a music reader, no, that's not how it goes. And so you're not following how it goes. But there's this inherent fluidity with the music that I think we have to respect. And I, as an editor, realize that, and I respect that. And I know that when I teach the songs to people, I'm oftentimes teaching it by ear. I'm oftentimes saying, put the book down, just sing, alaben todos el nombre de Dios, hallelujah. And they repeat it. And there it is. And it's on their lips, and it's owned, and it's characterized, and it's not dependent on notes. How as much and as wonderful a tool as written music is, it excludes for the moment until we do a better job of musical catechesis in that regard, to allow more people then to bring into the fold of music readership, literacy, that is, music literacy, so that the written form can also be digested and owned, if that makes sense.
Yeah, what I love about this in connection to the rest of the workshops that we're doing as a part of the summer series is a couple of things. First of all, what comes to mind is that if you're coming from a musical background where you expect everything you play to be written on the page, what you're being asked to do in this scenario is to be uncomfortable, to do something that makes you really uncomfortable for a greater good, for that greater good of singing and praying together, and going outside of your own comfort zone to do so. And that's what we're hearing echoed again in a lot of these workshops that we're having, that we're saying, yes, it's uncomfortable, and yes, we still need to do it. I think another thing is, this is kind of looking forward a little bit to our conversation with Alice and Gabe, but one of the things that I learned, from Alice primarily is that music does not live on a page. It's not a song until you sing it. And that's something that's their first nature in the Spanish-speaking community. Of course, well, a song is something that is sung. It's not what's on the page. I mean, the page might give you a couple suggestions, but you really got to listen, and you pass down this gift in a very, it goes back to that Caribeno, where again you have to be together to pass down this gift.
Yeah, you find a spirit of camaraderie in the music. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and then that sense that when you're in community, in mass, making music together, because it depends so much on listening and being there in the moment, what it's also saying to us is that we can't do this alone, that we have to do this together. We have to be together in order to make this happen. So there's lots of beautiful, like, philosophical or theological meaning making that we can apply that might help us stay motivated in that discomfort that we might initially feel if this is new to us.
I love that. And I think, we talked in yesterday's session a little bit about sharing of the gifts too. And I think there's a yearning in the Hispanic community to not want to view music notation as something scary. For a lot of Latinos who are in this country worshiping oftentimes in English masses, because of work schedules or something, there's like an imposition already to have to learn the language. And now in order to worship or want to make music, there's this kind of imposition that the dominant culture is saying, well, you also need to learn to read music. And it's like you have an added responsibility now of learning yet another language, and there's something exhausting about it. So if those doors can be opened in a way that it is not an imposition, but rather an entryway into a great world of discovery, and if that hand can be outstretched by those of us who have that ability to read music, if we can be the ambassadors of music notation to your Spanish choir, use the Aprende a Leer Música workbook or other methods, or just simply design something on your own that takes through the tour of music note values and the stave and basic things. You suddenly open up worlds, and you'll see that. At the same time, challenge yourself, free yourself from the notes. And I'm gonna share my screen here, and I'm going to show some pages. This is the keyboard edition, and I've just pulled some pages from the keyboard edition of the WLPGIA's Celebremos Hymnarium. So this is a bilingual hymnal that contains quite a bit of Spanish and bilingual music. And your typical page would look something like this. Here's your keyboard part. This is a piece by my friend Pedro Bocava, Con la Cruz. This is one of the first ones that I showed in the workshop as a sample or an example of polka style. But my point here is that you would see all this. It's a ton of black ink on the page. It's kind of unwieldy. There's a bunch of stuff going on. If I were to show you some of the Caribbean pieces that are in a salsa style, you would run screaming, because it's just loaded with syncopations and 16th notes, and you're just like, what is this? How would I finally, ever get through this? And there are really skilled music sight readers and pianists who would have no problem, yourself included, Kate. You have exceptional skills in that regard. But my challenge to you then would be maybe to not have to depend on all that, but simply on this, knowing how a polka style would work or a bolero style would work, and simply taking the melody and then extrapolating everything else based on how the style functions. And in doing so, you align yourself more with the typical Hispanic musician who is likely playing this on a guitar. And just like a guitarist is not necessarily reading tablature for every single fret that's going on here, but simply fingering a chord pattern and doing a strum, and that's how the music gets realized. Pianists can do the same thing.
Here, go back a page and let me ask you a couple of questions. Mm-hmm. Because this music is so often ensemble based. Go back to the full piano accompaniment one if you can. Mm-hmm. Because I see in your left hand what would typically be played by a bass player. So if you have this in front of you and you also have a bass player, do you really want to double what's going on, or what could you do in its place? Just play the right hand, or just kind of comp chords?
I'm of the I have less inhibition about doubling. Both because it can add weight and definition, especially in acoustically ambivalent places. So however that bass arrives to the ears of the assembly, and I'll put on my bass sound here on the piano. So I have something like that. So if I'm a pianist and there's already a very present bass, I won't eliminate my left hand completely, but I will likely take off the lower octave. So instead of running down there, I'll kind of fill up this more tenor area of the bass range, and so it adds. Now there might be some caution where you have clashing bass runs. Let's say I want to go up as the pianist, but the bass player goes down. But a lot of it's momentary. So it's up to the ensemble. I mean, if you have a spirit where your bass player is really in sync with your keyboard player and you know what's going on, and or your bass player has the capacity to actually follow some notated charts so that some of those patterns can align. When I go into the recording studio, one thing I do is make sure that the bass player and the piano are absolutely in sync with how how those are rendered. But in real-time performance, it's kind of fleeting, it's momentary, and I don't see it necessarily as detriment.
Yeah.
And it adds to the foundation.
Same,
So different
same
philosophy.
question on the reverse then. If you have a couple of trumpets or a couple of violins playing that, really kind of enlivening, invigorating introduction, then what would you do in that case?
Both takes are valid. I tend to like definition, and especially in scenarios where it's not necessarily well rehearsed and the trumpet players themselves may be dependent on some more solid guidance of what's going on. I don't see it as a problem to be doubled. And a lot of times this particular piece I'll also play on the accordion. So that has a double feel to it anyways. So if your brass players are going, that kind of thing, it's not a big deal to have those same frequencies align with them. It's simply helping to punctuate that. And especially in an area of the piece where it's interludish to begin with, the trumpet, the instrumentation comes to the forefront, the voices drop back. It's okay in my mind. Others would disagree with me. I mean, I have other directors can have other takes on that too. But there's a sense of in my operation that more is more. Oftentimes works.
Awesome. Okay, so then go back to the lead sheet and break this down a little bit. If I were just coming to this for the first time, as a beginner into the style or the context that we're looking at here, I can't do all that at once.
Yeah, it's tough.
Where do we start?
Okay, here's where we start. I'm going to move over to this, and I've also provided a handout. Matt, I don't know how you're disseminating that, but there's 3 PDFs that I provided, and one is the handout that I used for the actual workshop, which is a tour of styles. This is what I used to kind of go over the various aspects of the polka, the waltz, and the bolero. I've also provided 2 other handouts. One is specifically for keyboardists. It's accompanying in a Hispanic style. And this is where I break down exactly what you're asking, Kate, in terms of how these layers function. And so I look at what the right hand, the left hand are doing in the various layers they're in. And then I've also provided just a general guidelines from experience, the kind of things that work with the different instrumentations, just some concepts to keep in mind for liturgical application. Not necessarily for Hispanic styles, but just this is more of a general thing. But those are all available to everyone who's listening, the participants in this, to download and utilize. So let's go to this handout, Kate.
Okay.
And what I do is for Hispanic styles in particular, what I use is the example of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. And I use this to show specifically 3 distinct layers. And when Beethoven, and those of you who are pianists know this very well, but the piece starts with this. Right? And then and so when you start out, you think this here is the main business, but it's not, because when that melody comes in, this is not a particularly good keyboard to emulate the weight that I'm trying to give that, but the melody would come out da da da, and underneath it is a do 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 do. And so in my right hand, I'm basically doing double duty. I'm doing the melody, and I'm also doing what I'm calling the rhythm. It's keeping a little bit of the harmonic structure and also propelling the movement by the activity and the rhythm. Okay, and up here, and in the left hand is simply functioning, as a string bass, and it's done in octaves to lend some weight, but it also has its own melodic movement. right? And so we know that of Beethoven's own construction of it. We can see it very clearly in the 3 layers. Now there's 3 layers in 2 hands, so one hand has to do double duty. But when I'm doing Hispanic music, I apply the same principle here. And I basically take the melody as a prescribed top here. So what you would see on the melody for this particular piece, you know, you can add an upward harmony too, like a trumpet might. Okay, and then I'm adding then in the polka rhythm a simple bass pattern on 1s and 5s, and I'm going to different places with kind of arbitrary movements, but I'm getting from one place to the next. I'm going from 1 to 5. I have this many notes and this many beats to work that in. So I just do a run, you know, either up or down, whatever direction, or chromatically or some other kind of fun play on it. But I get from here to there. And that's all my bass, that's how my left hand is doing. I'm basically functioning as the bass guitar. And then going back to the right hand, I have the melody already prescribed. And you know this, it's in the outer fingers, which are the weakest. So you got to make sure that they're strong. And then in the inner fingers, you simply just add in what I'm calling the rhythm. And so on this handout, your right hand is doing melody, and it's also doing a rhythm. And you're simply doing the upbeats of the guitar. Now that rhythm layer is, it's secondary in importance. You have the melody prescribed, you have the bass line that is also prescribed, or the bass movements going on in there. And so if the melody is getting into these other fingers, simply drop out the rhythm and bring it back in when you have some open space to do it. So I'm not always doing the but I'm doing wherever the space allows it. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like the salsa picante. You know, you add enough to give it the flavor, the spice, but you don't want it overbearing. Mm-hmm. And just like in Moonlight Sonata, you don't want it to be the important thing. You know, you've heard pianists play it in that clunky kind of way, whereas when it's layered, it makes a difference because the melody is the important part and the rhythm is the secondary part. So some patterns on this handout here, I basically said, here's 1 going to 5, 5, 7, 1, 4, 1. Practice going in this pattern and just make up some bass lines. Up to 4, back down to 1, down to 5. You know, something like that. So that's how you like foray into it, and then you just do different things and try out different ways of making that happen. And so then you use this as your guide, and then you end up sounding something like that. But it could also sound completely different, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How do you know which style you want?
It's a great question. In this handout here, I talked about the polka, which is a 2/4 or 4/4 based. The waltz, of course, which is in triple, 3/4 time. But the bolero is in 4/4 typically. And the bolero, for those of you who haven't watched the workshop yet, it has, as opposed to the polka, which is, right? A bolero is more along this style. So even though we're using the same meter, the same time signature, the application of a different style gives it a different feel. So if I were to play Con la Cruz, there's a more gentleness to it, even though it still has a and so this is a stylistic choice you can do as as the interpreter, as a music director, as those who are putting together the way that this music will fit into your ensemble. And a lot of this for me is driven by the liturgical moment. I like my entrance hymns, my closing hymns to be upbeat. So I often and typically apply a polka if I have a piece that lends itself to it. So I will do, Con la Cruz, or here's another great example. This is Carlos Rosas' Este es el Día. That kind of stuff. So I want that kind of motion, that uplifting feel, to be characterized and embodied in the spirit of the style I'm using. Alleluias are another good example. Perhaps some of the acclamations, some glorias lend itself to that. And then in other moments, like the offertorio, the preparation of the gifts, I don't necessarily want something upbeat. We've just come off the creed, the prayer of the faithful, the homily. And so in terms of reflecting on the word of God and preparing ourselves for the table, I want a gentler spirit in that rhythm. So if I want what a particular song says, but I don't necessarily want a polka style, I'll apply a bolero to it. And that gives it a gentleness. Same thing with communion. I don't necessarily, typically, I don't necessarily want, a polka for the communion procession. However, I would want something that does have some movement to it. And so bolero, I find, works perfectly in that regard. And so if I have a 2/4 or a 4/4 piece that can be rendered like that, I can simply apply the style, and it works with good respect to the liturgy, I think, in those cases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There are some questions here, if you don't mind, if we kind of tackle this question about if you're new to this, what are we looking for in terms of publishing? I know that there's lots of music out there that's being generated in communities, but doesn't really have the chance to see life outside of that community, or maybe that's not a part of the motivation of the piece that was written or the one who wrote it. But what are we looking for in terms of publishing? What's important for the church to sing? Is that in any way influenced by the style in which it's written or lends itself to?
Sure. This is it could be a whole other session on this in terms of conceptually and kind of existentially, the body of Hispanic music that we have to work with. So I'll touch on it briefly, but my thoughts on it are as follows. There's a great wealth of Hispanic music. There is as much music in Spanish and in the Spanish-speaking world as we know in English, and there's as much breadth of styles also. So there is Spanish language hymnody, there's Spanish language chant, there's Spanish language traditional pieces, there's the equivalent of the 70s folk songs in Spanish. There is contemporary, what we call praise and worship music in Spanish. There's straight out hymns in Spanish that are constructed in strophic form and underlaid on a particular melody. There's a whole body of work from Spain, that has its own character and nuance. There's music from South America and all the countries of Latin America that have their own take on things. So it's immensely, mind-boggling, the breadth of music and the scope of it. Now, when it comes to liturgical application, and it intersects in a unique way. I wish we'd have more time and could talk about this further, but with the Latino spirituality. And a lot of that spirituality is personal, it's devotional. And so a lot of the music that comes from composers and artists imbuing that particular spirituality has that same characteristic. El choque in this case, where it collides sometimes, is liturgical appropriateness and also expectation, I would say, on Spanish-speaking culture of what the Mass should sound and feel like. And I think for better or for worse, and a lot of this has to do with, I think, the great gift of the charismatic movement that is part and parcel of a lot of Latino faith and expression. There's a lot of Spanish speakers who expect the Mass to also sound charismatic or sound like alabanza, noche de alabanza y noche de oración. And some of the Mass can, and some of our liturgical music can, but that isn't necessarily the requirement and what the liturgy is asking of the music to do. Some of it can intersect nicely, but not all of it necessarily. Some of this can also be described in just, the general Christian music that you hear. There's a lot of enthusiasm and energy behind, the equivalent of a praise and worship movement in Spanish. And you have wonderful composers contributing some fantastic, really heart-touching pieces, but they're not necessarily meant for liturgy. And I think sometimes the understanding of liturgy confuses what music can have a place or should have a place, and what is better left to services or devotions outside of the liturgy. So as a composer, and I encourage you, especially if you're going to operate and want to contribute music in the liturgical realm, to think outside just the me and my guitar. Y qué bueno es Dios para mí, y qué bueno Dios me hace sentir. But also have your voice be that of the people. And I think simply in thinking of that way, you construct a song differently. You instruct a song for another's voice rather than your own. And then it in turn becomes less soloistic and less about me. Even though my encounter with God is wonderful, I wanted to document that in this song. When I write a text for someone else, that's the beauty of a gabarain. That's the beauty of a palazón. These were composers, who wrote in others' voices. They wrote for other voices. They wrote for the voice of the pueblo. And their texts embody this, and their melodies allow that to happen. So if I were to give some just general advice in that regard, that's what I would encourage. And as a publisher, I'm looking for that kind of music that allows the assembly to sing, not just the soloist.
Yeah, that's helpful to know and reiterate to each other. I think that's what we're looking for in all of the music that we are looking to publish. I'm curious if you would be willing to, because I think often a misconception when we say Spanish speakers or the Spanish Mass, we tend to think of it as a homogenized style or group, but what we're exploring here is that it's quite diverse. So I'm wondering if you would talk a little bit about the styles that you explored as a part of the Caminemos project.
Yes, absolutely. I talked about three main styles in kind of the general form. What I didn't get into was some of the more Caribbean inspired styles, the kind of styles that you would find on the islands, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, and a lot of this has Afro influence as well. And so the Afro-Cuban is very much a part of how these styles took form and how they've been handed on down to us. It's very distinct, and as a musician, studying the notation thereof is absolutely fascinating, because to have it in notated form is something rare. You don't often see what's played in these particular styles in notated form. And when you do, it's like seeing an Oscar Peterson piece notated, right? It's like, how would you ever extrapolate or try to decipher what's going on? Yet on the ear, it just comes off as just butter, just so fluid. And so in the project Caminemos con Jesus, this is a project that we did with Tony Alonso. Tony, wonderful composer, and this was really a project of passion that he had to bring forth liturgical music and combine the liturgical sensibilities with the music of his father's homeland, which is Cuba. And so these Cuban styles are front and center for the entire project. The CD is Caminemos con Jesus. I mentioned it at the very end of the workshop, didn't have a chance really to get into it. But the styles in this album are based on what's known as the son, the S-O-N. And son is basically, folk music that started on the island of Cuba, and then it got evolved over the generations with different instrumentation, different rhythmic application. And so, derivatives of the son we know as salsa, modern day salsa, the rhythms that you would hear, Suavemente by Elvis Crespo, some of the rhythms that you hear on Gloria Estefan's albums, pop music, Enrique Iglesias, Ricky Martin's, all those kind of influence that you hear, and that those have been handed down by this folk idiom. And so we went back to the roots in this, and we explored some of this. And the fascinating thing about son, let me share this handout again, just so you see this. On my screen here, I just kind of put this Caribeno, but in a polka, you would hear a bass line go, and a cumbia. The waltz, of course, is like the polka, but in 3/4. The Bolero Romantico that we did was kind of like, and then you have a son montuno, which is kind of like the Bolero Romantico, but it's swung. So we would also recognize this as a calypso. And then lastly, I've simply called it Caribeno, but this one breaks it breaks pattern with all the other ones, because in this, you'll see that there's an anticipated arrival every time of the bass note right here. So, with the piano, I'm going to anchor our pulse simply with a downbeat. Something like that. So you hear the bass is always arriving. So in this case, you have to have more of an anchor going on with your right hand or with the other instrumentation, which is often accomplished. And then in this style, the piano often, and especially if you're not necessarily responsible for upholding a particular melody line, a typical piano's responsibility in this assemblage would be to add what's called a tecla. And so it's a pattern in the piano that functions both as outlining the harmony, but also imbuing the sense of movement and rhythm. I'm going to go to minor mode here. It's typically done up here. So it has this spirit of a lot of chromaticism. It's kind of anchored in this pattern. And it's all syncopated. It's not always falling on the beat, although you have some key pulses that are always anchored. And so when you see the notation of it, it's kind of a mess. It's all off the beat. It's all tied across the bar line, but it's really just a pattern. And as a pianist, especially non-music reading pianists, they would simply know that as the pattern that you're supposed to do in this particular piece or for this particular style. You couple that then with this bass pattern. So pianists, try tackling this. I mean, it's a fun thing. It's wonderfully scary up at the beginning, but you would find some really neat fun with it. I'm trying to think if I have some patterns in here. I think I have one, Los Magos que Llegaron. Let me find this one. This is a Puerto Rican tune. Oh, I don't know if I would have this bolero or not. Maybe at the end. oh, I don't want to waste time looking for it, but there's some notated examples. Now, the Caminemos collection itself is all notated. It's in octavo form, so pianists, if even before you venture into trying to put this pattern together, you have the notes there on the page as one way of doing it, and so you would have kind of your initial guideline into that, but then ideally you'd free yourself from it and just simply apply the style. I'll stop sharing and I'll actually play an example of a piece from Caminemos. So this is Caminemos con Jesus. This is the first track. Hear the bass. It's always rhyming. Now, one of the fascinating things about this is, and we haven't talked much about the percussion, but these things that are going on behind it, all that percussion stuff, even something like they all have particular nuance to how they are to be performed and how they're to be performed in conjunction with the other instrumentation. And so it was great working with the artists who actually recorded this album. They had the rhythmic aspect down to a science, and they would simply call out on the fly, arriba, os eso, or a certain style, and they knew exactly what was functioning between the bongos, the congas, the huiro, the maracas, all had different roles at very specific times. It was really wonderful to see that all operate with such exactness. Really an interesting learning experience as well. So yeah. As you're having fun with that in your own ensembles, you can play with how those work. And these particular styles are a lot of fun. You can see how they're just imbued and reliant on the rhythmic presence. They function on a piano, they work all right, but it really takes this to take off.
Yeah, it was so fun to watch the live videos of that Caminemos project. I wonder if we can even include some of those links to those live videos that we did when we send the follow-up email to this session. Because there was just there's so much life in the music. There's so much life in that room. And I think that we so need examples of that for so many reasons. But I think what struck me the most as I was watching you all work together on that project was that we're so used to talking about dwindling numbers in the pews and dwindling resources and what's the future of the church. And then you listen to this and you think, oh my God, it's so full and abundant and alive. Yeah. Who doesn't need that?
Exactly. I mean, it's an expression that's so rich with life, and it doesn't matter, from whence you come, and folks who are coming from various countries or cultures, carry that with them. And so the great gift of our taking the effort to better become acquainted with these styles and replicate it is it goes beyond simply singing in the language, but speaking to the heart,
Yeah.
And so I might bring up, even someone like Donna Pena, who's written music in English, but with Hispanic folk styles, like a wapango, that kind of thing is it has, its validity. It shows that beyond the language that's written on the page and being sung on the lips, that there's something inherent in the music and its capability to transmit, to transport people to a spiritual place, to their homeland, to wherever it may be, but it speaks on a much deeper level than just, notes.
Yeah. We have a practical question here about the use of some propers in Spanish liturgy, Spanish language liturgy.
So great question, thank you. And it's helpful to remind ourselves also of the great spectrum of music and type of music and type of liturgical music available to us and on the lips as a facilitator of sung prayer. So in my experience, which is granted limited to this country, and from what I've seen traveling around, I see the use of propers as not that prevalent. That could be for various reasons. It could be that they've fallen out of use, that they were never really properly introduced in an accessible way. It also has to do with, I think, the limited accessibility of something like the graduals, where those treasuries would be held in Spanish language. We have these gifts available in English. In Spanish, I've had much more difficulty coming across them. So me, as someone who has a large reference shelf, with that kind of difficulty, imagine someone at the parish level who, if they even knew about them, would want to hunt them down, would have difficulty in finding them. Now, that's not to say they don't exist, and I'm sure they were to be found in some Latin American countries may have done that work to have such sources available. But in general, the resource there, as what we can reference, there's a limitation. Couple that with an awareness of how the propers would function and normally be used. So I think there's some work to be done, and there's some opportunity there also. And there are some composers who are taking upon themselves to start setting them, especially since now that we have an official text, both by way of the Roman Missal in English and now the recently implemented Misal Romano in Spanish, which I actually helped render those chants for the book. For the U.S. bishops, I was on the committee and the team that created that body of work, which we now have and didn't previously exist. So all the prefaces are now set to chant tones, all the responses, the Eucharistic prayers, Our Fathers, the Mass proper itself. That now is there, and so we can carry forward that ongoing work. So the answer is a disappointing one. I don't see it much in use. However, that's now to say that the opportunity is before us, to say that this is something that's worth revisiting. It's part of our heritage, and it's very much part of the Catholic liturgy ethos. There, on the English side, there's been great efforts being taken to bring awareness to propers, the antiphons as the legitimate option for our entrance and offertory and communion chants. And so those can be worked in Spanish. And so this is a call out to composers. Start visiting those texts. We've had a deficit of that repertoire. This is a great opportunity to start exploring them.
Yeah. Talk to me a little bit about, I think it's related to this next question. Coming into Hispanic music styles as an Anglo, how do we keep before us kind of a caution about a tendency to kind of look at these styles as a type of tourism? And I think that's something that we've also talked about in other workshops too. Like, does our representation merely take us through a tour of the world to say, did it? And also, I think, some of the concerns some of our colleagues have, like, how do we approach Spanish language liturgy or musical styles without maybe inadvertently asserting a type of colonialism or assimilation into things that we understand as our kind of base knowledge?
Sure. And I think you can extend that question beyond simply styles, but even foray into ministry in general. We have to take caution at every step along that way, um, to really do it with sincere heart, to do it with cariño, to do it with a cultural ambassador, to do it with homework being done. So it's not just my narrow or naive interpretation of what this all is as viewed through my lens, and then suddenly reimposed back on this as somehow legitimate, but rather me in taking all this in and wanting to learn more and wanting to discover more and approaching it with the humility that I don't know what's going on, and my duty is to learn, to absorb it, to be open to it, and to set my own, oh, let's say my musical privilege aside, pour myself out and say I'm open to, in spite of my degree that I have from this great university, which has taught me all of this music theory and wondrous things of, musical nuance and great wisdom imparted on that. Put that all aside and say, I don't know anything here. Teach me. What do you got? Make those forays into it and say that, I want to learn and I want to do this right. And so to say that I am no longer the person in power, but I depend on you to teach me. I'm dependent on you in order for me to be better equipped to minister back to you.
Yeah.
That's the spirit, and that's the approach I think we take.
Yeah.
So I think in doing that, you avoid, I think, those obvious pitfalls. We've heard poorly rendered music. Hispanics trying to sound Hispanic, or trying to sound Latin, and coming off sounding very white or very gringo or very naive. And and well-meaning colleagues and composers have done that, and I think we all learn from that. I mean, if you were to ask even someone as upheld as Bob Hurd, his initial forays into this as an Anglo, his have greatly developed, and his sense of that. And I speak as a publisher, and in the publishing world, our own sense of what bilingual music can and should do for and in the liturgy has also matured since we started foraying in, our initial efforts with Pan de Vida and those, first bilingual pieces that kind of opened the floodgates to this kind of awareness. So it's evolving, it's exciting, and it's ongoing, and it's work that we all are responsible for carrying on.
Yeah, I'm just struck as you're saying it again too, that have taken that first step of knowing that if you're new to this, that your job is to be learner. Then it kind of sets a domino effect of all the other questions that we need to be asking of our communities, right? Like, if you, the music director, are the learner, then who's being paid? The one doing the teaching or the one doing the learning? And whose voice is represented at the table? The ones doing the teaching or the ones who are still learning? Which is, I think, a good domino effect to set into motion.
Yeah, and break the cycle where money had typically been directed, allocated in one direction. Now that with the awareness, and of those of us who perhaps were the beneficiaries of that system, now realizing that our own development and ability to perform our ministry to an entire parish-wide scheme is dependent on these other fountains of wisdom, and so can investment now be made in that direction as well, equally deserving.
Yeah. So good question too, Carlos, about how we can bring this to life, and also kind of, just be cautious about the way that I think an Anglo perspective tends to assume the Hispanic music styles can be representative of party or fiesta or the up parts of mass. I think Roger Holland talks about that a lot too. When people, when they want something upbeat, then they go and look for the gospel music, but that it neglects a whole expression of emotion from the community, when that's kind of the case. So I appreciate your question there too, Carlos.
Yeah, and you know, when we talked about that, when you guys had the session on liturgical representation in liturgy, I think that all intersects here in very important ways. So it's not just, like you said, it's not just showcasing, or voila, here's this style, voila, here's that style, la da da.
Yeah.
You know, it's not liturgical ping pong. It's this very deep investment in getting to know it, and I think in doing so, then we more authentically allow that to be you know, a true vehicle of prayer, as opposed to just a superficial showcase.
Yeah, and I think too, it's an opportunity, and you know, that's weren't saying in all kinds of situations, but like, it's not the job of the Sunday liturgy to teach you how to be better in communion with one another. It's not the job of the Sunday liturgy to teach you how to be invested in music styles. There's a lot of work to be done outside of our prayer life too, and so maybe taking advantage of learning how to incorporate some of these styles just into our daily musicianship might be a sign of our investment. That's going to really count too.
I mean, there's so much we could touch on with this. I mean, from these more existential issues regarding our ministry and our interaction between cultures, you know, to diving right into the music. I mean, I had plenty of samples and examples to show of the various styles, and so you know, that's something that we can keep maybe as the, you know, the impetus to keep moving forward on this kind of that it is a great joy, you know, to be able to explore these things. So great thing.
Yeah. And it's almost like you should write a book on this or something.
Right after the lectionary psalms, the hymnal, individual project. But yes, it's very worthwhile. And you know, and I say this with complete honesty to everyone listening in. I am learning and have to learn so much more. You know, what I've shared here is what I've accumulated over this wondrous path that I've been blessed with, that God has given me, you know, in my experiences with various Latino communities, and exploring of my own cultural heritage, and how that intersects with the gifts of so many others that I've met along the way. And that learning continues. I'm happy to share what I know, but I also say with great humility that I have much to learn also. So I'm hoping you're accompanying me on that journey of discovery.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for being here. And I'm grateful to have you, Peter, and grateful to learn alongside you, learn from you, and all of you who are gathered here. So let's do this again.
Yes.
Let's keep doing it lots.
I have much to do. Be sure to check out the workshop if you haven't already. Go revisit that. Check out the albums. Caminemos con Jesus, Cantemos by Pedro Rubalcaba is another great album that just showcases a lot of different styles done well, all with you know, a liturgical understanding behind it. So there's some great things out there, and artists are doing wondrous things, and also support our Hispanic composers who are contributing great gifts to this church, both in Spanish language and bilingually. So all of you I know listening in are ambassadors in some way to your own communities, and the very fact that you're here listening in means that you have an investment and an interest in that. So I applaud and encourage and continue to uphold your own efforts in your own communities to make this difference and to bring communities together. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Peter. Perfecto.
I don't know.
Have a good. Oh, are you gonna play for us on the pink
No,
guitar?
I'm not. I have to at least end on a spectacular flamenco note.
Yes, that's very cool of you. Okay, everyone. Thanks for joining us again. Don't forget to sign up and tune in tomorrow with Gabe Huck and Alice Parker. Thank you, Peter. You are simply the best.
Thank you, Gia. Thank you to all. Dios les bendiga.
Yes. Bye, everybody.